In an age when Hollywood's brightest stars lived larger than life, one man stood apart, not for his charm, not for his fame, but for his unwavering integrity. His name was Audie Murphy, America's most decorated war hero. Before the cameras ever found him, before the glamour and the glitter of Tinseltown, Murphy had faced a world far darker than any film set could imagine. He had stared into the chaos of battle and survived. When the guns fell silent in Europe, Murphy returned home a legend. But what awaited him in Hollywood would test him in ways the battlefield never did. This is the story of Audie Murphy and the 6 stars he could never respect, 6 icons of the golden age whose behavior, vanity, and moral emptiness clashed with everything Murphy stood for. That if this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. He was only 20 when he came home from war, a baby-faced Texan, barely 5'5", carrying more medals than any soldier in American history. 21 decorations, including the Medal of Honor, all earned before his 21st birthday. But when the parades ended and the cheers faded, Hollywood came calling. Producers saw in him not just a war hero, but a marketable image, a symbol of courage, discipline, and clean-cut American values. They offered him a new battlefield, the silver screen. Murphy accepted, but not because he dreamed of stardom. He once said, "I didn't want to be a movie star. I just didn't know what else to do." Yet, even as he rose through the ranks of the studio system, Murphy never forgot what he'd seen in the mud and blood of Europe, courage, sacrifice, and the cost of vanity, and it was vanity in all its Hollywood forms. That disgusted him most. To the public, Errol Flynn was a god, the face of swashbuckling adventure, the man who embodied daring and charm. But to Audie Murphy, Flynn represented everything false about fame. Behind the camera, Flynn was reckless, indulgent, and by many accounts morally adrift. Murphy had heard the whispers even before he met him, stories of arrogance, of cruelty, of political sympathies that raised eyebrows. Flynn loved to play the hero, but Murphy had been one dot, and he found Flynn's romanticized image of bravery almost insulting. There was a time they were scheduled to appear at a studio banquet together. Murphy reportedly declined the invitation after learning Flynn would be honored. When pressed, he simply said, "Some men pretend to be brave, others don't have to." It wasn't jealousy, it was contempt. Flynn's decadence, his boasting, his scandals, they were, to Murphy, a mockery of the ideals so many soldiers had died defending. If Errol Flynn symbolized the reckless idol of the 1930s, Marlon Brando was the voice of rebellion in the 1950s. Audie Murphy watched Brando's rise with both admiration and dismay. There is no denying Brando's genius. His raw, emotional power reshaped acting forever. But Murphy saw something else behind that method madness: arrogance. Brando was famously dismissive of authority, of rules, of tradition. The very things Murphy believed held civilization together. He refused interviews, mocked the military, and treated fame like a joke. Murphy, who carried the weight of fallen comrades on his conscience, couldn't stomach that indifference to owe him. Brando's rebellion was self-indulgence, the posturing of a man who had never seen what real defiance cost. He once told a friend, if he'd spent one day in a foxhole, he'd know what rebellion really looks like. For Murphy, Brando wasn't a threat, he was a warning. Proof that Hollywood was drifting toward chaos, where talent excused everything and discipline meant nothing. By the late 1950s, Hollywood's wildest nights belonged to the Rat Pack: Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and on the edges of that orbit, the odd, shadowy figure of Peter Lorre. They were legends, but they were also excess personified. Casinos, cocktails, and whispered scandals filled the gossip columns. Murphy, who struggled privately with insomnia and post-traumatic nightmares, had no patience for their games. He avoided nightclubs, rarely drank, and refused to chase publicity through debauchery. One evening, invited to a Sinatra-hosted after-party, Murphy reportedly stayed for 10 minutes. He left without saying goodbye. When asked later why, he said, quietly, "I've seen men die for less nonsense than that." To Murphy, the Rat Pack's revelry wasn't harmless fun. It was an insult to the discipline and dignity he'd fought for. He despised the idea that celebrity excused indulgence. As for Peter Lorre, Murphy's distaste went deeper to Lorre's cynicism and morbid humor, traits that made him fascinating on screen, repelled Murphy in person. He once said that Lorre made a joke of everything, even tragedy. For a man who had seen real tragedy, that was unforgivable. Intensity, they called it. But to many who worked with Kirk Douglas, it was something closer to tyranny. Murphy respected professionalism, discipline, precision, excellence. But when Douglas's temper flared on set, when he belittled crews and barked at co-stars, Murphy saw not strength, but weakness. During pre-production talks for a possible Western collaboration, Murphy reportedly turned it down flat, saying, "I fought too hard to take orders from another bully." Douglas's fiery ambition made him a Hollywood powerhouse, but it was that same hunger for dominance that Murphy found unbearable. The irony was painful. Both men were veterans in their own way. Both had known hardship, but Douglas sought power, while Murphy sought peace. To Murphy, arrogance was the root of every corruption he'd seen, from the battlefield to Beverly Hills. Few men embodied cynicism quite like George Sanders. Elegant, articulate, and self-aware, Sanders played the sophisticated villain better than anyone. But what he played on screen, he lived in private. He once wrote, "I am a pessimist by nature and by profession." To Murphy, that attitude was poison. Where Murphy found meaning in sacrifice, Sanders found boredom in everything that he mocked patriotism, dismissed heroism as a childish illusion, and spoke openly of life's futility. To a man like Murphy, who had buried friends for a purpose, such nihilism was intolerable. He reportedly told a director, "If that man believes in nothing, he shouldn't be trusted with a story about men who do." Murphy respected talent, but not at the cost of humanity. And in Sanders, he saw the death of both. Years later, when news came of Sanders' suicide, Murphy said nothing publicly, but those close to him claimed he shook his head and muttered he finally did what he'd been rehearsing for his whole life. It wasn't cruelty, it was sorrow. For Murphy, cynicism was just another battlefield where too many men surrendered without fighting. The final name on Murphy's quiet blacklist was Tony Curtis. To the world, Curtis was charm incarnate, the matinee idol who could light up any screen. But Murphy, ever the realist, saw beneath the polish. He'd heard the rumors, the carefully crafted, tough Brooklyn kid persona, the exaggerated tales of service, the constant need for admiration. Curtis represented to Murphy what Hollywood did best and worst, the art of illusion. While Murphy spent years wrestling with the invisible wounds of war, Curtis chased headlines and lavish parties. Their paths crossed briefly during a charity event. Murphy stood in uniform, quiet, reserved. Curtis, in a tailored suit, worked the crowd like a salesman. Later, a reporter asked Murphy what he thought of him. He smiled faintly and said, "He plays a hero better than most men live one." That was the closest Murphy came to an insult, measured, sharp, and true. To Murphy, Curtis's brand of celebrity was the final proof that Hollywood's values no longer aligned with the ones he fought to defend. Audie Murphy never became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, but he didn't want to be. His films were modest hits, westerns, war dramas, tales of courage and redemption. They mirrored his own life more than he liked to admit. Off-screen, he battled demons that no metal could silence: insomnia, anxiety, and the lingering echoes of combat. He was one of the first public figures to speak openly about what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet, even in pain, he refused to compromise his principles. He turned down roles that glorified cowardice or mocked sacrifice. He refused to work with those who treated fame as a substitute for honor. Hollywood called him difficult. Murphy called it having standards. When Audie Murphy died in 1971, his passing was quiet. A plane crash in the mountains of Virginia. He was only 45. At his funeral, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with actors. Medals gleamed beside movie stills. Two worlds, rarely at peace, came together to honor a man who belonged to both and neither. In the years since, his legend has only grown. Not just as a war hero, but as a rare figure in Hollywood history. A man who measured worth not by fame, but by conscience. Those 6 names he quietly condemned were never about hatred. They were reminders of the difference between playing a hero and being one. In a world that worships the spotlight, Audie Murphy stood in the shadows, steady, unyielding, and real. He had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its best. Hollywood, for all its glamour, could never quite understand him. He didn't act brave. He was brave. He didn't seek fame. It found him. And when others traded integrity for applause, Murphy simply turned away. Maybe that's why his story endures. Because beneath the reels of history, beneath the glimmer of celluloid and myth, there remains a soldier who never stopped fighting, not against enemies, but against the corruption of character itself.